All right, so what I've been asked to do is just to talk to you a bit about history as a discipline, what it is, what's its scope, applications, other such things associated with that. I'll take about 20 to 30 minutes to talk to you, and then we can take the next 20-30 minutes to field any questions that you might have. Now, I've just shared with you the first page of a very famous work of historical thought called the Muqaddama by Ibn Khaldun. And it contains a very brief but very effective description of what we mean by history and what the purpose of historical thought basically is. Right now, I understand it, most of you are in the first semester? Yes. All right. And other semesters as well. So you can just hang on to this. It's a good definition just to keep with you as we go forward. Now, history as a discipline is pretty old, as you might expect from a discipline called history. It's about 2,500 years old, and it's one of the disciplines that emerged during the classical period of the Greek civilization. The first historian whom we are aware of was a gentleman by the name of Herodotus. And Herodotus came from a city known as Halicarnassus, which is today in western Turkey. It is called Burma. Herodotus wrote about a great war that had taken place about a generation before his own time. This war had been fought between the Greek city-states led by Athens and Sparta on one side, and the Persian Empire on the other side. And in that context, Herodotus wanted to tell us the story of that conflict. Now, in wanting to tell us the story of that conflict, Herodotus was not the first person to attempt to give us an account of the past. Chronicles had existed for hundreds, arguably even thousands of years before Herodotus came around. But what distinguished Herodotus was that he wanted to try and explain why that conflict had taken place. And he tried to identify rational or logical causes of that conflict. So, when you think about the word history itself, it literally means an inquiry. And Herodotus's inquiries sought to answer the question of why a conflict had taken place between the Greeks and the Persians. It drew a distinction between various mythical or religious reasons that the Persians or Greeks may have believed in for their mutual antagonism, and rational causes or historical causes that one could find some evidence of by talking to people, by finding some evidence, by looking at documents, that sort of stuff. So Herodotus was not just the first historian in a sense, but the methods he used to piece together his narrative are methods that historians and social scientists more generally still use. He tried to find original documents, he traveled to the places where important battles and events had taken place, he tried to talk to as many people as possible who might have had first or second-hand knowledge of that conflict, and he used logical deduction in order to try and fill any gaps. Very often what Herodotus does is that he gives us competing explanations. So he tells us that, well, this thing happened according to this group of people, this is what happened, and this other group of people has this opinion about why this same event took place. And what I think is, looking at it, let's say reasonably or logically, is that probably what happened was somewhere along this line. So in Herodotus, you have this interrogation of sources. You have an attempt by him to try and explain different conflicting accounts of the same event. And of course, he tries to interpret the evidence at his disposal. Now, Herodotus was also interested in trying to find some sort of a pattern in the events that he was describing. So, Herodotus applied a particular frame or lens, which was based upon his understanding of the effects of power and wealth on human nature. So the question that kept antagonizing him, that kept bothering him, was that why was it that again and again we see leaders committing the same types of mistakes? Doesn't matter who the leaders are, getting into this war is a horrible mistake with faults on both sides. The way the war is fought is also characterized by terrible human suffering, terrible miscalculations on all sides. And the outcome of the war, somewhat surprising in that it's a bloody stalemate which the Greeks claim to be a victory in their own way because they prevent the Persians from overrunning them, is also something which reflects the frailty of our ability to think rationally when we are actually making decisions. So, what Herodotus wanted to try and teach us was about human nature, was about how we behave, how historical actors behave, and why is it that they very often end up making very unwise decisions. The tragedy for Herodotus in a way was that his job was to provide us with a rational account of human irrationality. That he was trying to give us a reasonable account of why our leaders and our states and our empires behaved in such an unreasonable manner. And he kept on illustrating this through various stories. So, within the histories, you will encounter lots of interesting empires, lots of interesting states, lots of interesting leaders, and with a few honorable exceptions, they tend to all fall prey to something which the Greeks called hubris, which is an excessive pride, an excessive confidence that blinds one to what is reasonable. And that hubris drives everyone to make essentially similar mistakes, which then produces terrible miscalculations and wars and chaos and all sorts of other such dislocations. So, if we were to focus on that, what Herodotus wants us to understand is that, well, we don't know everything that's happened in the past. But based upon what we can know and based upon what we can logically deduce, we have to give as reasonable an explanation as possible for why things have happened the way that they have. Of course, no accounting of the past is definitive. So every generation of historians, every generation of thinkers will re-examine the record, will add to the record, may even find new sources or new approaches that help illuminate what has happened in the past. So in that sense, history is not about certainty. So if you're going into history in order to make a final determination of why everything has happened, you're probably going to be disappointed. That is more the realm of moral philosophy and ideology than history as such. What instead history encourages you to do is to try and think in relation to cause and effect. So history is a study of causes. In a way, many sciences are of a historical nature because they are also interested in studying cause and effect. The difference is that the phenomena that they study can be put in a laboratory or observed under empirical conditions. When it comes to human behavior across long spans of time, we normally don't have that luxury. So, the historian is a little bit of a detective as well. And Herodotus personally was a pretty good detective in how he, ran around trying to find things out about what had happened. So, in this respect, you have a very strong tendency in history to try and go back to the beginning, or as far back as we can, of what has happened. And this is something that very often distinguishes historical analysis and historical thinking from other types of social sciences analysis. So to give you just one example of this, if you are, let's say, studying the history of South Asia, you can of course focus on the period 1947 to present, or any period that you feel like. But a lot of the social, psychological, and political behaviors that you see are not actually determined or fixed in their origin in any one particular period. So, if you have only studied, let us say, contemporary South Asian history, or you're only aware of, let's say, South Asia since 1947, you are in a way missing out on at least 2,000 to 3,000 years of recorded history and another 4,000 to 5,000 years of archaeological evidence of the history before that. Think of it another way. Imagine that, let us say, you are 20 years old or 30 years old, and you can only remember what has happened to you over the last 30 days. The rest of your life is a complete blank. You can't remember. Now, your sense of self, your ability to function, your ability to understand the world around you will all be impeded. So, what history always encourages us to do is to go to the beginning. So, especially if you have a chance to study historical books, including Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, they typically begin with an account of geography and environment, which sorts of builds into the prehistory of any given place. Then they try to pick up the thread from as far back as they can. And from there, they attempt to come down to the period that they are interested in discussing. So, whenever you are looking at any type of historical analysis, you should be aware of that particular sort of framing. That analysis will hopefully take you back a long way. Now, this is of course different from a lot of the analysis you might see in terms of international relations or economics, where the frame of reference is at best a few decades. In history, the frame of reference can be centuries. It can even be thousands of years. It can even be longer than that if you go into periods before we have historical records, but for which we have good prehistorical archaeological evidence. So, if you are thinking historically, you're going to try to go back as far as you can, and then from there come to the contemporary or the present period. Now, in historical analysis, there is something which is very important that we must always acknowledge. We don't always know why things have happened in the past. And at any given point in time, there could be more than one reasonable explanation for why something has happened. It is for this reason that the collective noun for a group of historians is what is called an argumentation. So, if you think of a bunch of historians, the collective noun for historians is an argumentation. And the reason why a group of historians is called an argumentation is that you can have a rational perspective about why things have happened in the past that does not necessarily agree with other rational perspectives. So let's take the example of the French Revolution, which is perhaps one of the most famous examples in history. You can come up with a pretty compelling argument that the economic crisis of the French monarchy was very decisive in bringing about the French Revolution. You can also come up with a pretty compelling argument that it was the social and intellectual movement of the Enlightenment that actually prepared the change in opinion that allowed for the political and social changes of the revolution to take place. And you can also argue that it was various political blunders by the leadership of the French monarchy that aggravated what should have been a manageable crisis into a full-blown revolution. Now, all of these perspectives are in their own way correct. And very often what you will find is that historians might emphasize one type of explanation over other types of explanations. That does not mean that one type of explanation is exclusively right and other types of explanations are therefore wrong. When you are approaching a problem, it's always a good idea to try to approach that problem from multiple historical angles. So if you want to, let us say, understand the Mughal Empire, you should definitely read Marxist historians like Irfan Habib and learn more about the agrarian structure of the Mughal state. You should also read more classical political and administrative historians like Ibn Hassan and study how the governing structure operated. And you can also read biographies and other accounts of that period. So all of them will enrich your perspective. The objective, of course, is to keep on expanding your understanding of whatever aspect of history you are particularly interested in. There is also no legitimate type of history that is essentially more important than any other type of history. So you might well consider political or military history to be more important. And I think generally speaking, most professional historians are political or military historians. But at the same time, you might be interested not in great questions of politics or military affairs. You might be interested in a very simple sort of question, that how did an ordinary person living in Mughal India live their life? What did they eat? What did they wear? How did they entertain themselves? What type of social structures did they operate in? That is also a perfectly legitimate area which you can investigate. So there's no right or wrong type of history in that sense, that you have to limit yourself to that this is correct or that is incorrect. Then of course there is another very important problem that history often faces. And that is that history is typically not a discipline that people in power are very fond of. So, the reason for that is that when you are giving a rational accounting of why things have happened, you can't really be wedded to justifying the behavior of one group or one entity in that struggle. And what that actually means is that if one of those groups happens to be a dominant group in the society in which you live or in the world at large, they are perhaps not likely to enjoy what you have to say about them. So, in this context, you may then see a situation where historians face a situation where whatever it is that they are writing is not necessarily very, very well received. But that in itself is perfectly all right, because good historical works typically stand for decades, if not generations, and very often when people go back to them at a later time, when the contemporary controversies have died down, they may come to appreciate them in a much more effective way. The other, of course, problem is that those who actually need to learn from history the most, people in authority, people who are in a position to make decisions, are also typically the least willing to heed its lessons. That, of course, is the problem which Herodotus identifies right at the beginning of history as a discipline. That there is a basic issue over here, and that problem is that, well, the people who are in the driving seat are simply not willing to stop and ask for directions. They simply want to keep on traveling by intuition or by impulse, or maybe they actually think they know where they are going, but they don't actually have that figured out. So, when we talk about historical analysis, it is something which is, of course, very useful in any kind of crisis situation to know about what has happened before. But it is also something which typically leaders and decision makers are likely to discount, or they are likely to ignore. And there is, of course, a very important reason for this. When you think about political leaders or decision makers, they believe that they can shape reality by their decisions. What history basically teaches them is that however powerful they might be, there are very real limits to their ability to shape the reality they are operating. And that is not necessarily a lesson which they are particularly happy to learn or to heed, at least when they are in that situation. So, when we think about history, just to sum this up, it's of course about the past, but it is a rational inquiry into the past in order to try and explain why things have happened. And in doing so, it encourages us to think in the long term, to look at the past as holistically as the record will allow us to. It also encourages us to embrace the complexity of the human experience. So, history is not so much a single discipline as it is a set of arguments that share a common approach in terms of trying to understand how and why the past has unfolded. And in that, history encourages us to be skeptical. It encourages us to try and be as reasonable as possible. It also encourages us to acknowledge our biases, such as inevitably exist. And it encourages us to try and derive lessons from what has gone before. But above all else, it encourages us to see ourselves as a very small point in a very long story. A story that began long before we arrived, and one that will hopefully continue long after we have left. Thank you. Okay.